Welcome back, kids. If you remember last time when we read from the very first Easter, we heard about the wonderful things Jesus had did in his ministry and how he came into Jerusalem riding on a donkey with people waving palm branches and what he began to do that week in Jerusalem. Well, our boy in the story, Christopher, wanted to know what happened next. And here's what happens. Well, it was the Thursday after Palm Sunday. Jesus had been staying in Bethany at the home of his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. That evening, he and his disciples went into Jerusalem. They gathered in an upstairs room to eat their Passover dinner. Then Jesus did something that made this Passover dinner different. Go ahead, read, Chris. Luke 22, verses 19 and 20. And Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Luke 22, verses 19 and 20. And as we read these passages, I encourage you can stop the video and look them up in your own Bibles and read along. Well, continuing with our story. Chris stopped reading. "Haven't I heard those words before?" "Yes, you have. That was the beginning of the longest meal in history," Dad said. "Come on, Dad, what do you mean?" "We call the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion that meal which was started that night. And it continues to be celebrated throughout the world today. Jesus said, 'Do this in memory of me.' Believers who eat the bread and drink the wine receive the body and blood of Christ and remember all he did to win our salvation. The Lord's Supper is called a sacrament, something through which God offers his grace and grants forgiveness of sins." Then Dad added, "Remember those men who didn't like Jesus and were trying to get rid of him? Read the words of Jesus in the very next verse. Luke chapter 22, verse 21. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table." Luke 22, verse 21. Judas, one of the 12 disciples, had been plotting with Jesus' enemies. For 30 pieces of silver, that was about enough money to buy a suit of clothes. Judas would show them where to capture Jesus that night. Did Jesus do anything to stop Judas? Chris wondered aloud. "No," Dad replied. "Jesus knew that this plot was part of what was supposed to happen that week." Judas left to join Jesus' enemies. "So what happened next?" asked Chris, leaning his chin on his hands. After the Passover dinner, Jesus and his disciples walked to a garden at the foot of the Mount of Olives. The garden was called Gethsemane, which means oil press. Jesus and his disciples loved to visit this spot. That night, though, Jesus was deeply troubled because he knew what was going to happen next. Read what Luke tells us. Luke 22, verses 41 and 42. Jesus withdrew about a stone's throw behind them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Luke 22, verses 41 and 42. Chris was puzzled and asked, if Jesus was God, why would he pray to himself? "Good question," Dad exclaimed. Through the miracle of Christmas, God also became a true man in Jesus. The human part of Jesus could suffer, even die, as all humans do. So he prayed for God's help. Keep reading. Luke 22, verse 45. When Jesus rose from prayer and went back to his disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Luke 22, verse 45. Chris demanded, "Why didn't they stay awake? I would have." "People went to bed just after dark in those days, Chris," Mom said. "They had no electric lights, so this was late for them." Besides, the disciples had no idea what a terrible time Jesus was having and would have later. Okay, but what happened to that traitor, Judas? And that's where we'll end today. To find out, come back for the next section of the book, The Very First Easter. Thanks for listening.